federal contract executives who are not federal employees but are on the federal payroll, about which this bill says zero, completely silent. Zip. Okay, I yield back. I reserve, continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to address a few of the comments that the gentleman opposite made when he said not a word has been mentioned about bonuses for contractors. I would remind the gentleman that in the NDAA we addressed this very subject. And so that was addressed, of which I'm sure the gentleman was here for that particular vote. But as we've looked at this, we have addressed that particular thing. And so I'll yield in just a moment. I'll yield in just a moment. And so I want to go ahead and talk about a couple of other things, though. We talk about this pay freeze and how, you know, we're asking so many people to suffer. I'm not talking about the normal pay that we would give employees. I'm talking about the excessive bonuses that have failed to be an incentive anymore. When you give a bonus to 75% of the employees, it seeks to be an incentive. In fact, quite the opposite. All you have to do is make sure that you are not in the bottom quartile. It says all I have to do is perform better than only a few people to get my bonus. So if I'm just better than the worst 25%, I get a bonus. That's not an incentive, and that's why we're looking at 33%. It rewards those people who rise to the top, the cream of the crop, and we need to do that. I also want to mention that, you know, we're talking about all these pay freezes. You know, where is a pay freeze not a pay freeze? Only in Washington, D.C., Mr. Speaker. 99.4% of federal employees got an increase in salary during this pay freeze. That's the only ones we denied were 6 out of every 1,000 employees. So the gentleman opposite making comments that, you know, they've sacrificed it, indeed they have, but it's not as if they have not gotten pay increases. What do I tell my constituents back home who are dealing with double-digit unemployment? You know, they would love just to have a job. Many of them would take a job at 10 to 15 to 20% less than what they were making if they could just go to work. And yet here we are talking about people who continue to get raises as if they are suffering. You know, we've got to make sure that we're clear on the subject, and we need to make sure that we're fair. And I keep coming back to the word fair, because when we are not fair with the government responsibility that we have, the American people lose trust in their government. And it is time that we hold it accountable, give tools to those managers that reward good behavior and good performance, but yet not continue to dole it out at the expense of every American taxpayer. And with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Continue to reserve.
Gentleman's going to reserve his time. Gentleman from North Carolina.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from North Carolina continues to reserve.
All right. Just one final point before I yield. The gentleman is correct. We did address contractor caps on pay in the NBAA, but we capped it at $950,000 a year. That's a far cry from anything that any federal employee is earning here. As I mentioned before, the head of our VA hospitals makes $179,700. That's the max. Meanwhile, private contractors working for the federal government are making $950,000 this year in 2013 with the NBAA caps in place. I'm just saying, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, and there's an opportunity in this bill to cap these salaries, and we have not done that. With that, I yield back the balance of our time. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. The gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for his candor and his passion with which he rises and debates it. I do want to point out, though, that what we're talking about here are apples and oranges. You know, when you start to look at contractors and the benefits of those contracts, those are really issues that we must address, and I'm willing to work with him on a bipartisan basis. But let's not take our eye off the ball. You know, why would we allow Sarah Hall Ingram, who's going to put in and be administering over the Affordable Care Act, a bonus of $35,000? Why would we award a bonus of almost $31,000 to a gentleman that played Mr. Spock? It's indefensible to me. I can't imagine why my colleague opposite would want to defend that and why he wouldn't want to have tools to let managers manage the process. And I'm going to close with this point. Daniel Pink writes in a book called Drive, and it's about motivational theory. It's about the fact that bonus impact is minimal. And I think we see that even here, because the surprising truth about what motivates us. It says, and I quote, "The carrot and the stick approach to motivating employees through bonuses and benefits is statistically ineffective. What they would rather have is a mastery of their position. They would rather have autonomy. They would rather have a sense of purpose that the job that they're doing is very meaningful." So in essence, what it says is that if we get rid of the bureaucracy, our federal employees will be more motivated to do a good job knowing that they're fulfilling a purpose. And yet we continue to throw bonuses at them over and over again, Mr. Speaker. I just have a hard time going back home, as a number of my colleagues would go back home, and defending these excessive bonuses. And with that, I would urge all of the folks here, all of my colleagues, to join with me in supporting this critical bill, the Common Sense and Compensation Act, H.R. 1541, as amended. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1541 as amended? Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. The opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
Ask for a roll call.
Gentleman asks for the yeas and nays. Without objection, the title is amended. The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8, Rule 20, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1660 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1660, a bill to require the establishment of federal customer service standards and to improve the service provided by federal agencies.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, and the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Americans depend on federal agencies for certain vital services. Failure by federal agencies' employees to process in a timely manner requests for help or information can result in frustration and financial hardships. Poor customer service should not be tolerated at the IRS any more than it is at the private sector companies that must continually earn the right to serve its clients. H.R. 1660 helps ensure our government is more responsive to the public by establishing customer service standards and performance expectations for each agency. It will enable citizens to provide direct feedback concerning specific agency employees, including at the IRS, and have that feedback considered in employee evaluations that impact awarding bonuses. H.R. 1660 puts taxpayers first by holding federal workers accountable for their interactions with the public. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 1660, the Government Customer Service Improvement Act. I thank Representative Cuellar, my friend from Texas, for his leadership and his persistence in advocating for this bill. The federal government provides services that significantly impact the American people. There are many dedicated federal employees who perform their jobs with professionalism and distinction. But there are areas in need of improvement. For instance, the Department of Veterans Affairs takes an average of 243 days to process a disability claim, and that is unacceptable. This legislation would require the Office of Management and Budget to establish government-wide standards for customer service delivery, including target response times for phone calls, emails, letters, benefits processing, and payments. I thank the chairman of the full committee for working with me during the committee's consideration of this bill. The bill we are considering today includes a pilot project to evaluate customer feedback systems. This was a compromise that will provide a more limited application than requiring every agency to institute their own individual feedback system. I hope the chairman will continue to work with us and all members on both sides in moving this bill as we go through this legislative process. It's important that we ensure that the bill can achieve its intended purposes without negatively impacting the ability of federal employees to do their jobs. H.R. 1660 is a good government bill in the truest sense, and at this point I'd like to yield for whatever time he may consume to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar, who's the principal sponsor of this bill.
Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to thank the gentleman from Massachusetts for his time, gentleman from North Carolina also, and I certainly want to thank Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings and the staff, both the Democratic and Republican staff, for helping pass this bill and got it out of the Oversight Government Reform Committee, and all the work and the compromises we worked out to make sure that we got a bipartisan bill. The primary goal of the federal government is to serve taxpayers, and currently U.S. law does not require federal agency customer service standards, which is long overdue. Every day, taxpayers interact with the federal government on a regular basis, whether it's through the passport services to travel, student loans through the direct loan program to pay for higher education, health insurance through under Medicare to get benefits, or Social Security for retirement planning. All those services are vital to operate good government, especially in times when Americans are relying more on this type of services. Too often we hear veterans are waiting months to get critical medical services, or federal employees experience long waits for the retirement benefits. These are just two examples, but millions of Americans rely on federal agencies for vital services, which is why we must usher a new chapter to accelerate response time and overall performance for a better customer experience. With only one-third of Americans holding a favorable opinion of the federal government, according to a 2012 report from the Pew Research Center, this is a necessity that we must change. The bill is simple and necessary. First of all, H.R. 1660 improves customer service standards across the board. It does this by requiring the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, to develop performance standards to determine whether federal agencies are providing high-quality customer service and improving service delivery to agency customers. Second, the bill raises the bar for enhancing quality and access for customer service. This is accomplished by requiring agencies to collect information from their customers regarding the quality of service and ensuring that there is customer feedback which will be used to develop the standards. This bill also requires the development of a customer service feedback system, the result of which must be included in annual performance reports. Just like the private sector strives to provide excellent customer service in business, the federal government should also embed better service to bring efficiency. H.R. 60 has no cost. This bill also has precedent. We passed this last session, and now we're hoping that with enough time that we're passing this, we'll get it over to the Senate so we can get it passed. This effort to examine agency customer service is also bicameral. Senator Warner and Senator Johnson dropped a companion bipartisan bill as well. H.R. 60 seeks to operate a better federal government to provide the taxpayers who find them a better quality service which they deserve. I thank you for the time, and I encourage my colleagues to support and pass this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for his foresight in bringing forth this bill, and certainly appreciate the fact that we need to be providing better customer service to those that call in and talk to employees on a regular basis. And so I commend the gentleman from Texas for that, and with that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
At this point, I have no further speakers. I yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have had some vigorous debate, and really what this is about the American people back home. It's about doing the responsible thing, for them to see that government actually works, and that we are willing to stand up with the people back home to do what is best and right and return government back to we the people. It has been great to hear some of the arguments from my colleagues opposite. I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, the passion of which he has argued these points, and I look forward to working with him in a bipartisan way on some of these issues that he has highlighted. And I urge all the members to join me in support of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1660 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Yep. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek, Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2769 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2769, a bill to impose a moratorium on conferences held by the Internal Revenue Service.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscoe, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, each control 20 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the subject of the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as I may consume.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2769 offers the House an opportunity to go back to our constituents who are asking this question when we're out and about at home. What in the world is the House of Representatives doing about the IRS scandals? And there's a series of scandals that we've heard about, that we've heard testimony from, both in the Ways and Means Committee, on which I and the ranking member serve, and also the Government Oversight Committee, and my suspicion is maybe some other committees of the House. But when our constituents say, what in the world are you doing, this bill that we're discussing is part of that remedy. So here's one of the things that we've come to learn, Mr. Speaker. We've come to learn that the Inspector General, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, did an audit, and in the course of the audit discovered that there were funds that were being misused in the context of conferences. Some of them were conferences that, looked at even in the most favorable light, even if you were looking at it in the most favorable light from an IRS point of view, were clearly gratuitous and an abuse and overspending. Some of this had to do with videos that were videos of parodies of the television show Star Trek, and actually I think a bunch of nonsense. Some of it had to do with the purchasing of trinkets. Some of it had to do with overspending. So the Inspector General very clearly said, look, there has to be a remedy here, and so what the House is proposing in consideration of this bill is that all of these IRS conferences have to stop. Hit the pause button on all of them until the recommendations of the Inspector General are met. And when the Inspector General then reports to Congress that those recommendations that would stop the nonsense have been fulfilled, and under a new set of criterion then, the IRS says that they've met these, the Inspector General certifies it, then the conferences can go on. I think it's thoughtful. I think it's approached in a bipartisan basis. I think I've been very encouraged, the spirit with which the Democrats and Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee have worked together to investigate and inquire of the IRS, but not just looking through the rearview mirror. Looking through the rearview mirror, yes, but also saying, what do we learn? How do we prospectively make sure that these things don't happen again? And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I shall consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
The bills today and the bill on Friday on ACA are more about politics than policy. Politics at any cost by the Republican majority. They want to change the subject from their inability to legislate and their refusal to go to conference on a budget so that we could implement long-term deficit reduction and not threaten our economy with default again this fall. And their abysmal failure to act on jobs legislation. All of these months, there has been no real effort to join hands on their part on jobs, the #1 concern of the American people. So they hope to launch their so-called Republican playbook for August, where they have told their members to go home and echo the same message and reaffirm their theme, fighting Washington for you. They have failed miserably to fight in Washington for you, the American people. There was terrible mismanagement at the IRS in the exempt division. I was among the first to call for the acting commissioner and Lois Lerner to be removed of their duties. But instead of exploiting the deep problems at the IRS tax exempt division, instead of exploiting them for political purposes, we should be fixing these problems and restoring the trust of the American people in that entity, the entity to which they voluntarily pay taxes. And the Republicans have desperately sought to try to tie their anti-government message to the President. Let's review the Republican approach, some of it. Chairman Issa said, and I quote, "This was the targeting of the President's political enemies effectively, and lies about it during the election year so that it wasn't discovered until afterwards," end of quotes. And Chairman Hal Rogers said, and I quote, "Of course, the enemies list out of the White House that IRS was engaged in shutting down or trying to shut down the conservative political viewpoint across the country, an enemies list that rivals those of another president some time ago. Totally, totally false." And the facts were clear that both conservative and liberal groups were in the groups set aside by the IRS for further scrutiny. And when that became clear, the Republicans shifted to the notion that the conservative groups receive more scrutiny. When all evidence to date has indicated that there was no political motivation involved and no one outside of the IRS was involved, the majority Republicans here shifted to the notion that they don't have all of the documents. But the political motivation has been that of the Republicans. I want to also at this time express our deep disappointment with the work of the IG and the audit that he did on the tax exemption division. He failed to disclose that both conservative and liberal groups were set aside for further development. He failed to disclose that he asked his investigative arm to review 5,500 emails, and they found no evidence of political motivation. This flawed report set the stage for the Republicans' manipulation of the facts, and now we are going to spend months cleaning up that work. As to the bills before us today, these three bills, we agree that the IRS should stop unnecessary conferences, that the employees should not do their work with any political motivation, and taxpayer rights should be codified in the law. This bill would impose a moratorium on conferences held by the IRS until the Inspector General has submitted a report to Congress that certifies that all recommendations from the TIGTA audit of the IRS conference in Anaheim have been implemented. This audit report included 9 recommendations, as the majority has now said, for the IRS to improve oversight of conferences. And I just want the facts to be put on the table here as to what's happened by the leadership now of IRS. 3 of the 9 recommendations have been fully implemented, and it is anticipated that the remaining 6 recommendations will be put in place shortly, likely within 3 months. We all agree with the recommendations. The IRS has already agreed to those recommendations, and importantly, it must be acknowledged, is in the process of implementing all 9 of these recommendations over the next few months. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I suppose that's an endorsement of the bill. It took a while, and the ranking member took us on a journey, and I appreciate the journey. But I think what the ranking member said is that he actually supports H.R. 2769, and I appreciate that. I think one of the things that may have been persuasive to the ranking member, which was persuasive to me, is part of the report, the summary from the Inspector General, where the Inspector General, after reviewing all of this, says that procedures at the time of the conference did not require IRS management to track and report actual conference costs. So, in other words, the IRS wasn't holding to a standard that it holds you two, Mr. Speaker, and your constituents, or the ranking member's constituents, or my constituents. Because when my constituents go to the IRS and they say, well, I don't have my receipts, or I don't have this, or I don't have that, they get a cold, glassy-eyed stare from the Internal Revenue Service, and no mercy from the Internal Revenue Service. So I am delighted and I am encouraged, and I very much appreciate the ranking members pointing out the progress that the IRS has made and the other areas where the IRS needs to go. Just let me briefly draw the body's attention to what these 9 actual recommendations are. After all, this is not climbing Mount Everest, but it is just pretty solid, common sense recommendations. Number 1, it requires the IRS Chief Financial Officer to verify that appropriate information is being tracked to ensure actual costs of the conferences can be established and audited. That's what I referenced a minute ago. It implements a policy to determine whether training sessions held at the conference qualify for continuing professional education credits for CIA or CPA employees. Set standards for the site of a conference. The report recommends against non-governmental facilities unless the benefits will offset increased expenditures and spending will not be seen as unnecessary by the public. It implements procedures to identify when non-government event planners are used, how much they're paid, and how they're being selected. It directs the Chief Financial Officer to establish standards regarding planning trips for conferences. It outlines the necessity for produced videos at conferences in response to the claims that the IRS spent over $50,000 on video skits. It sets standards on whether hotel room upgrades should be allowed. It requires the submission of W-2 tax forms for local IRS employees who were reimbursed for staying overnight at conferences. Just a little irony there, if you're tracking with me, Mr. Speaker. And then finally, it recommends that the CFO establishes procedures to determine the necessity of an exhibitor's hall, promotional items, and other significant costs. Common sense, thoughtful. It's meant to restore the public's confidence in the Internal Revenue Service, and it is my hope that it is widely supported on both sides of the aisle today, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves this time. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Might I ask, are you ready to close?
I am.
Thank you. I'll do that. I yield myself the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields the time. Balance.
I think all of the recommendations make sense. We Democrats throughout our caucus, the President, all of us joined in making clear what we thought of mismanagement within the IRS and what we thought about the abuse of conferences. As I said before, with this leadership of IRS appointed by the President, all of these recommendations either have been implemented or are in the process of being implemented. So before the end of the year, I think well before it, this one problem, there are others, will be resolved. I support this bill. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I urge an aye vote on H.R. 2769.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2769 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. What purpose, gentlemen from Illinois rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2768 as amended.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2768, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to clarify that a duty of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue is to ensure that Internal Revenue Service employees are familiar with and act in accord with certain taxpayer rights.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roscom, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin, will each control 20 minutes. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the subject of the bill under consideration.
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 2768 is entitled the Taxpayer Bill of Rights Act of 2013. What it does is it addresses this fundamental question, and it was there is an ambiguity, apparently, Mr. Speaker, in testimony that you heard in the Ways and Means Committee, the ranking member heard in the Ways and Means Committee, some other testimony that we've heard from the other body, and that is this: who's responsible for having an understanding of what's going on at the Internal Revenue Service? Who's responsible for the missteps and the mishaps and so forth? And there was a theme that we heard from a couple of folks that you would have thought would say that the responsibility was theirs, but they weren't really willing to take the responsibility. And here's what I mean by that. There currently exists 10 enumerated rights in the statute. Let me just quickly run through these. It's important that we look at this as a foundation upon which we have an expectation that the Internal Revenue Service is operating. Taxpayers have the right to be informed, the right to be assisted, the right to be heard, the right to pay no more than the correct amount of tax, the right of appeal, the right of certainty, the right of privacy, the right of confidentiality, the right to representation, and the right to fair and just tax system. That's current law. Well, here's where part of things get lost in the shuffle. that apparently the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service doesn't view that as that person's responsibility to make sure, A, that the Commissioner knows it, and B, that other employees know it. So what we're doing today, what we're proposing to the House today, is let's put this in a place in the statute that unambiguously says that this is the responsibility of the Commissioner. So I alluded to a couple of quotes before. I want to walk through them with you just briefly, and I want to put it in this context. What we're talking, Mr. Speaker, these are fundamental rights that are foundational and that the Congress has put into the Internal Revenue Code to make sure the taxpayers are protected. This is settled ground. This is common knowledge. This is a general understanding. There's no new ground. Nobody's hunting out ahead of the pack here. This is a very solid doctrine, these 10 enumerated rights. Now, the former former commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, Douglas Shulman, said this. This was before the Finance Committee and the other body on May 21st. He said this: I certainly am not personally responsible for creating a list that had inappropriate criteria on it. What I know, with the full facts that are out, is from the Inspector General's report, which doesn't say I'm responsible for that. With that said, this happened on my watch, and I very much regret that it happened on my watch. He also said this: I had a partial set of facts, and I knew that the Inspector General was going to be looking into it, and I knew that it was going to be stopped. Sitting there then and sitting here today, I think I made the right decision, which is to let the Inspector General get to the bottom of it, chase down all the facts, and then make his findings public. We heard in the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Speaker, from the former acting commissioner, Stephen Miller. He said this: I think that what happened here was that foolish mistakes were made by people trying to be more efficient in their workload selection. The listing described in the report, while intolerable, was a mistake and was not an act of partisanship. Now, can you imagine how we would all be feeling if somebody came and there was an officer of the law who said, well, you know I'm supposed to read Miranda rights. I know that's what the law says. I know it's settled doctrine. I know that that's what a defendant expects, but I was busy. I had a heavy workload. And so I chose not to Mirandize the defendant. I just figured I didn't have enough time. Now, there's so many things that are going on in this IRS story. There's so many components and elements of it. Much of this, is actually things that we have yet to learn. I think we're marveling every day at new facts that are coming out, and I think the House has been very disciplined, frankly, in letting the facts speak for themselves. But there is a fact, and here it is, that there is ambiguity about who is in charge at the IRS. There is ambiguity about who is responsible at the IRS. And when the IRS commissioners, both of these recent appointees, not the current one, but both recent appointees, have this sense of, well, the responsibility belongs here and the responsibility belongs there, I think it is incumbent on the House to say, no, the responsibility for this lies with the Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service, and that's what the plain language of this bill does. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I shall consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I support this bill, and I think everybody will. I think we all agree that IRS employees indeed should perform their duties in accordance with the taxpayers' rights outlined in this bill. These rights have been outlined a number of times in the National Taxpayer Advocate's annual report to Congress. In fact, Democrats in the past have introduced legislation to codify these rights, and the National Taxpayer Advocate's support for codifying these rights dates back to 2007. So I urge support of this bill. Are you ready to close? I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I urge an aye vote on H.R. 2768.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 2768 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended, the bill is passed, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
All right, I got it here too.
Oh, there you go.
Thanks.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 2565 without
Clerk
amendment.
will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 2565, a bill to provide for the termination of employment of employees of the Internal Revenue Service who take certain official actions for political purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman, Mr. Renacci, and the gentleman, Mr. Levin, will each control 20 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to add extraneous material on this bill.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge approval of H.R. 2565, the Stop Targeting Our Politics IRS Act. Despite being introduced only 1 month ago, this bipartisan legislation already has over 75 co-sponsors, but also overwhelming support from the American people. This support shows that the vast majority of members and Americans, regardless of their party affiliation, believe the IRS should be above politics. This is not a partisan issue. It is absolutely unacceptable for a government official to consider the political leanings of any taxpayer when conducting official business. If it is determined that a federal employer did, in fact, engage in targeting, they should be relieved of their duties. It is that simple. In fact, this is so common sense. In 1998, Congress enacted the IRS Restructuring and Reform Act by a vote of 402 to 8. That legislation sought to bring accountability to the IRS by allowing for immediate termination of IRS employees who engaged in the so-called 10 deadly sins against taxpayers. A large percentage of the members here in this chamber today supported those reforms back then. Unfortunately, while the legislation covers many offenses, it did not include political targeting. I have no doubt this was a simple oversight. I cannot imagine any member would support a process for removing an employee for bad behavior, but somehow not consider political targeting to be bad enough. This is exactly what my legislation would do. It would specifically spell out that any IRS employee, regardless of political affiliation, who targeted a taxpayer for political purposes could be immediately relieved of their duties. This legislation does not change any of the procedures for removing an IRS employee. It simply adds political targeting to the list of 10 deadly sins already in existence. Any statements to the contrary are simply not true. Some have said this bill is not needed because the current investigation is still going on. This legislation does not in any way impact the current investigation. It's simply, regardless of current situation, if you work for the IRS, you cannot target taxpayers for political purposes. There should be no controversy in that. There is currently a process place to remove bad actors. There is currently a list of offenses that would subject an employee to that process. All I want to do is add political targeting to the list of fireable offenses. Regardless of the outcome of this current investigation, the reputation and credibility of the IRS has been badly damaged. The IRS needs this legislation, the entire federal government needs this legislation, and most importantly, the American people need this legislation. They need to know that they will not be targeted by their government for political purposes. They need to know that those who are entrusted with the vast power of this federal government are going to be act in a responsible and professional manner or be held accountable if they do not. I urge all members to support this legislation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you very much. I yield myself such time as I shall consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Let me spend a few minutes, if I might, discussing the context of this legislation and a bit of what's in it. The 1998 Act, as mentioned here, enacted a list of 10, quotes, acts or omissions, end of quotes, for which IRS employees face mandatory firing. This bill would amend the 10th Act or omission to expand existing grounds for termination to include political motivation. We all agree that IRS employees should not act with a political purpose. We all passionately believe that. But I wanted to be clear because of the environment in which this bill is being considered. There is absolutely no evidence that any IRS employees acted with political motivation in the matter under investigation. The Inspector General reviewed and concluded, and I quote, that there was no indication that pulling these selected applications was politically motivated, end of quotes. The Inspector General has come before Congress repeatedly and testified numerous times that he has found no evidence of political motivation. At the very first hearing on this matter that was held in mid-May, the Inspector General was asked if he found any evidence of political motivation in the selection of the tax exemption applications. He answered, and I quote, "We did not, sir," end of quotes. When questioned by my colleague on the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. McDermott, whether he stands behind the assertion that, in quotes, no one acted out of malice or political motivation, the Inspector General answered, and I quote, "We have no evidence at this time to contradict that assertion, sir," end of quotes. When my colleague on the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Becerra, asked him if it is correct that he did not find any evidence of political motivation here, the Inspector General replied, and I quote, "That is correct, sir," end of quotes. In addition, and I want to emphasize this, staff from the Ways and Means Committee and the government oversight committees of this House have interviewed 17 IRS employees directly involved in this matter under oath, and none of these employees have suggested that the IRS actions were either politically motivated or the result of influence by any individual or organization outside of the IRS. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, the IG asked his investigative arm to review 5,500 emails. The head of investigation concluded this, and I quote, "The emails indicated the organizations needed to be pulled because the IRS employees were not sure how to process them, not because they wanted to stall or hinder the application. There was no indication that pulling these applications was politically motivated. The email traffic indicated there were unclear processing directions, and the group wanted to make sure they had guidance on processing the applications, so they pulled them." So, that's end of quotes. So it's clear that there's no evidence of political motivation by the IRS under investigation now. Indeed, there has been too much political motivation in this entire effort by Republicans. I want to say just a few words about what's in the bill, and you, Mr. Gentleman from Ohio, and I have discussed this. The majority did not follow regular order. This bill did not come before the Ways and Means Committee. It did not essentially be considered either at the subcommittee level, I believe, or the full committee level. So the Republican majority, in my judgment, did not carefully draft their bill to ensure that it was consistent with the current statute. If it had done so, there might have been improvement to this legislation and added the language willful failure as it appears under 4 of the other acts and omissions. I hope, I think this bill will go to the Senate as it should. I hope if it considers it, it will take up this issue of whether or not there should be a willful requirement in terms of this conduct, because we're talking about the ability administratively to discharge an employee. And I think if there's political motivation on their part, action should be taken. I think it's also important that we understand that there had to be some willfulness in that action. I now reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of time. Gentleman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I'd like to start by saying that this bill has nothing to do with the current investigation. It's really about installing public confidence back when it comes to the IRS. I would also like to say that this bill makes no changes to the current process or procedures for removing an IRS employee. It would simply add politically targeting to the list of offenses listed in current law. And I've already said that in 1998, this legislation was approved 402 to 8. As far as not having a hearing, is that technically going to be the reason the opponents vote against restoring credibility to the IRS? And for the record, this bill was widely circulated, and I was more than willing to make changes to the bipartisan legislation. I drafted this language to remain as close to existing law as possible. My addition is simply added to the current offense listed number 10, targeting a taxpayer for personal gain. Under current law number 10 does not use the term willful. Therefore, I did not add willful. However, targeting a taxpayer for personal gain or political purposes could only be done in an intentional manner. And let's not forget, the Commissioner of the IRS always has the ability to not remove somebody. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan.
It's now my pleasure to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, a member of our committee and the vice chair of our caucus, Mr. Crowley of the great state of New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank my friend and colleague and ranking member of our committee on Ways and Means for yielding me this time. And I do appreciate, and I don't want to call to question the motivation of how this bill came to the floor, but I find it hard to believe that we're here on this particular issue dealing with individuals who work at the IRS and what would be deemed as a fireable offense and somehow not be related to the ongoing investigation into the IRS and the political motivations behind not the gentleman, but my Republican colleagues as a whole, in bringing this bill to the floor without a hearing in committee. It just happened to fall onto the floor this afternoon and has no tangential connection to what's happening. It's just, I find, a little bit difficult to believe. But, Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill because it's not an attempt at better governance, but rather it is a solution in search of a problem. In the months of investigations into the IRS targeting of nonprofits, here is what we found without a doubt. Progressive groups were targeted alongside Tea Party affiliations. There was no interference or coordination in the targeting scandal by anyone at the White House or at the Department of the Treasury. No IRS agents have ever been cited or even been accused of forcing their own personal political ideology onto the process of granting nonprofit status. In fact, the person who was in charge of the IRS nonprofit office in Cincinnati self-identifies as a conservative Republican. Those are all facts. So this bill is a solution in search of a problem. But still, Mr. Speaker, I recognize the sensitive powers at the fingertips of IRS employees, and I would be open to looking into whether we should add something like this as a fireable offense. But the Committee on Ways and Means, as I said before, held no hearings on this bill. We've had many hearings of testimony on the issue of the IRS, but not on this specific bill. It was never considered in committee. It was drafted at the last minute to fulfill, in my opinion, the Republican Party desire to say how awful government is. What better way to do it than to use the IRS? And when you govern like that, these are the kinds of bills we get on the floor. But worst, I believe this is just a ploy being used to cover up the facts surrounding this IRS problem. And I believe it actually harms our ability to address the real management issues at the IRS that were the basis of the problem to begin with. So once again, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, bills just don't fall out of the sky and land on the floor of the House without a hearing in committee. Can I have just 15 additional seconds?
No, minute.
Bills just don't fall out of the sky, Mr. Speaker. They don't. They're here to meet a purpose. The purpose was to evade the committee process in the regular order and to bring this bill here before we break for the summer recess, the last week in Congress before the summer recess, for a political purpose. I've stated it. It's not worth restating again, but I do suggest that the notion or idea that this bill is on the floor has nothing to do with the ongoing investigation, in my opinion, very hard to believe. And with that, I yield back the balance.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I hope the American people are listening to this debate, because the American people are the ones that have the right. They have the right to know that they're not going to be targeted, whether they're conservative, liberal, whatever organization they are. And that's what this bill is about. It's about the American people. In regards to bringing up in a hearing, it's interesting because I think my colleagues were at the hearing where I actually asked the commissioner what he thought about political targeting being added, and he indicated he wasn't sure if it was in there, but thought it was a good idea. So even the acting commissioner made that comment that this was an issue that should be considered. This is about the American people. This is about restoring confidence not only in the American people, but in the IRS. As an employer for over 28 years, I wanted to make sure all of my employees felt the integrity, and when there was a concern, we had issues with fixing that problem. This is about fixing a problem for the American people. I hope the American people continue to listen to this debate, because this is one that I know the American people is behind, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan.
Is the gentleman from Ohio ready to close?
I am.
I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized.
There's no question there should be no political motivation. So far, there's been no evidence there was any. This bill is being brought up in a context. It's outlined in the Republican playbook, and that is go home and essentially go after the government. I think we should make sure in Washington that we act so the government acts on our behalf. So everybody can reach their own judgment. I've told the gentleman from Ohio that the way you drafted it, I'll just read this. The present language says threatening to audit a taxpayer for the purpose of extracting personal gain or benefit. That's the present language. Threatening is willful by definition. You can't threaten somebody unwillfully. Instead, we have new language, and I want to pick up the point of Mr. Crowley in terms of regular procedure. I mentioned it before. It's important that we follow regular order in this institution. And if this bill had come up, the bills before oversight were brought before the committee. We had no chance to act on this, and I would have suggested that the word willful be placed before it. However, everyone will vote as they wish on this. I think it will pass. It will go over to the Senate, and I will suggest, if this passes and the Senate decides to act, that they take a clear look at whether there needs to be a requirement of an intentional misdeed as defined here, because what we're talking about is the discharge of an employee, and whether it's IRS or some other government employee, whether in a local unit or any unit, it seems to me, or in the military, for example, I think we want to have some consideration of due process for them. So that's the basis for the discussion here. This bill, I think, talks about political motivation, and I just want to add, as I end, the thought expressed before. There's been no evidence of political motivation by an IRS employee, and the effort to try to tie what happened there to the executive was an example of pure political motivation and terribly misguided and, I think, harmful kind of connection when it did not exist. We should not do that in this country. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Ohio.